The wind had teeth that night. It came racing down the valley, rattling the windows of Elias Mercer's old ranch house and sweeping up the last of the autumn dust. The lantern flame inside his kitchen guttered, throwing long, restless shadows across the walls. Elias sat alone at the table, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside his hand. Listening to the endless wind had lived with silence for so long that it had become a kind of company. It filled the spaces where voices used to be, his wife's laughter, his daughter's footsteps, all swallowed by time and tragedy out here, miles from town. There was no one to hear his thoughts but the coyotes, and they didn't care much for sorrow. Then came the knock-soft at first. Almost lost to the howl of the storm, he frowned, thinking he'd imagined it, but then it came again, a desperate, uneven rhythm, not the confident rap of a neighbor, but the sound of someone pleading for mercy. Elias rose slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, habit more than threat, and crossed to the door when he opened it. The wind rushed in, biting cold and wet with sleet, and there she was, a young woman stood on his porch, drenched to the bone, clutching a carpetbag to her chest. Her dress was travel-worn, her hair loose from its pins, her lips trembling with cold. The lantern light caught the pale curve of her face, frightened yet proud somehow, as if she'd fought the world to make it this far. For a moment neither spoke, then she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, "I have nowhere else to go." The words hit something deep in Elias, something buried beneath years of dust and regret. He hesitated, not out of cruelty, but because he knew what kindness could cost a man who opened his heart too wide could lose everything. In a single heartbeat, he'd learned that the hard way still he couldn't leave her there. "Come in," he said gruffly. Stepping aside, she hesitated, looking at him as if to make sure the invitation was real. When she crossed the threshold, the warmth of the hearth met her like a sigh. Elias closed the door behind her and watched as she tried to catch her breath, dripping rainwater onto his floorboards. "Sit by the fire," he said. "You'll freeze if you stand there." She nodded. Moving carefully toward the hearth, her boots squelching, he tossed another log into the flames, the crackle filling the silence between them. "Name's Elias Mercer," he said finally. "This is my place." "Lydia," she whispered, "Lydia Hartwell." Her voice trembled when she spoke again. "I came here to marry a man named Thomas Hammond. He sent me for a new life, but when I arrived in town, they told me he'd taken fever and passed 3 weeks ago. I had nowhere to turn, no family left." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of loss before. Plans torn apart by fate's cruel hand. She glanced down at her hands, twisting the letter she carried. "I walked as far as I could before the storm came. I saw the light from your window." Elias studied her quietly. There was no deceit in her eyes, only exhaustion. He poured a second cup of coffee and slid it toward her. "Drink," he said. Her fingers brushed his as she took the cup, a fleeting touch that startled them both for a heartbeat. Their eyes met across the firelight. Something unspoken passed between them, the recognition of two people who knew what it meant to be left behind outside. The wind howled like a wounded animal inside. The ranch was still again. The only sound, the slow crackle of the fire. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying the stranger who had walked out of the storm and into his quiet, empty world. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he opened that door, his life had already changed. The storm raged long after midnight, hammering the roof like 1,000 drumming hooves. Wind moaned through the eaves, and the old timbers of Elias Mercer's ranch groaned with the weight of the weather inside. The fire burned low, painting the walls in flickering gold. Lydia sat wrapped in one of Elias's old wool blankets, her damp dress hanging by the hearth to dry. The steam rose from the fabric, filling the room with the faint scent of rain and smoke. Elias poured himself another cup of coffee and sat at the table, the scrape of the chair loud in the quiet. He wasn't Sure what to say. Conversation wasn't something he'd practiced in years. He'd lived too long with the kind of silence that grows roots, Lydia. Broke it first. Thank you for letting me in, she said softly. Staring into the fire, I know you didn't have reason to. Elias took a slow sip, his eyes steady on the flames. Storm like that. I wouldn't leave a coyote outside. Her lips curved just a little still. Ungrateful, most men would have turned a stranger away. He looked up at her then, really looked. She was young. Maybe mid-20s, but there was an old sadness in her eyes. Something that didn't come from age, but from being disappointed too many times. Her hands, clasped tight in her lap, trembled slightly when she spoke. I thought I'd be a wife by now, she said, voice small. Instead, I'm a burden before I've even begun. Elias's brow furrowed. Ain't no burden sittin' by my fire, he said gruffly. You'll stay till the weather clears, then we'll figure the rest. Lydia nodded. Eyes lowering, but the tightness in her shoulders eased a little. She looked around the room, the heavy oak table, the worn boots by the door, the rifle hung neatly above the mantel. Everything about the house spoke of solitude. Do you live alone? She asked after a moment. 5 years now, he said. The words came clipped, but his tone softened when he saw the question behind her eyes. My wife passed fever, took her quick. Lydia's voice caught in her throat. I'm sorry. Elias gave a small nod. World don't give much warning before it takes what it wants. For a long time, the only sound was the hiss of rain on the roof, the air between them filled with quiet understanding, not pity, but something gentler, two people shaped by loss, sharing the same firelight when the flames began to die. Lydia rose and knelt beside the hearth. May I? She asked, reaching for the poker. Elias hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead. She moved with the careful grace of someone used to being useful, feeding the fire, adjusting the logs, coaxing the light back to life. He found himself watching her, his eyes tracing the calm determination in every motion when she turned. The light caught her face, the curve of her cheek, the faint glimmer of a tear she hadn't wiped away. You work hard for someone who's lost so much, he said quietly. She met his gaze, the corner of her mouth lifting faintly. So do you. For the first time in years, Elias felt something stir in his chest. A warmth not from the fire, but from her voice. After a while, he rose. Fetched a pillow and a spare quilt from the chest. You can take the bed, he said. I'll sleep in the chair. She shook her head quickly. No. I couldn't. It's not a question, he interrupted. Gentle but firm, Lydia looked at him for a long moment before whispering, Thank you. She took the quilt, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude when she finally lay down in the small bedroom. The storm outside began to fade. Elias sat by the dying fire, the clock ticking softly behind him for the first time in 5 years. He didn't dread the morning, and somewhere beyond the walls, dawn began to break, not in the sky yet, but in his heart. The sun returned slowly to the plains, cautious after the storm. The fields glittered with melted frost, and the air smelled of wet earth and juniper inside the Mercer ranch. Life began to move again. Quietly, cautiously, Elias rose early. As he always did, the storm had toppled a fence post near the south pasture, so he saddled his mare and rode out before dawn. When he came back, the cabin windows glowed faintly with lamplight, and the smell of coffee reached him before he opened the door. Lydia was already awake, sleeves rolled, stirring something in a pot. The sight stopped him cold. She looked so natural there, like she'd always belonged in that kitchen. Humming softly under her breath. I hope you don't mind, she said, turning with a shy smile. You had flour and a little sugar. I thought I'd make biscuits. Elias's lips twitched. Can't remember the last time I had biscuits that didn't come from a can. Well, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then you're overdue. It was the kind of morning he didn't know he'd missed. Simple, quiet, filled with sounds that weren't just the creak of old wood for a moment. He let himself imagine it lasting, but peace has a way of drawing attention in a world built on hardship by midday. A trail of dust rose on the horizon. Elias spotted it first from the porch. A single rider. Moving fast, he squinted into the sunlight, unease prickling at his gut when the rider came closer. Elias recognized the star glinting on his chest. Sheriff Doyle. A man with eyes like cold river stones. The sheriff dismounted without ceremony. Boots crunching against the dry dirt. "Morning, Mercer," he said. Voice clipped. "Heard you've got company." Elias crossed his arms. "You heard right. She was caught in the storm." The sheriff nodded slowly, gaze drifting toward the window where Lydia's figure flickered behind the curtain. "That so you mind if we talk?" Elias didn't invite him in, but the sheriff stepped past him anyway. Lydia froze as he entered, her knuckles white around the dish towel. "Ma'am," Doyle said with a curt nod. "Name's Sheriff Doyle. I don't mean trouble. Just looking to set a few things straight." Lydia swallowed hard. "Yes." "Sheriff?" He took a folded paper from his coat. "There's been word out of town, fella named Charles Hammond says you ran off with a sum of money that wasn't yours. Says you were supposed to marry his brother, Thomas." Before the man passed, her face went pale. "That's not true," she whispered. "I never saw a cent of it." Elias's eyes hardened. "You think she looks like someone running from money?" The sheriff shrugged. "Not my call to make, just doing my duty, but Hammond's on his way here come week's end. Thought she ought to know." He turned to leave, then paused by the door. "Mercer, you've had your share of ghosts. Don't go adding another." When the sheriff rode off, dust trailing behind him, Lydia sank into the nearest chair. Trembling, "He'll come for me," she said quietly. "He won't stop until he's made me pay for things I didn't do." Elias set his hat on the table and knelt beside her. His voice was steady. "Low, then he'll have to come through me first." She looked at him, startled. "Why would you do that?" He didn't answer right away. He just held her gaze until the truth was clear in it, a truth he wasn't ready to say aloud. "Because no one deserves to be left out in the storm twice," he said. Finally, Lydia's eyes glistened. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since she arrived, she allowed herself to believe she might be safe outside. The wind had gone still, too still, the kind that comes before another storm. Not of weather this time, but of men and pride, and in Elias Mercer's heart, something fierce began to wake, the kind of fire a lonely man feels when he's finally found something worth fighting for. Snow came early that year by the second week of November. The plains were a white sea, wind carving ripples into the drifts like waves. The world beyond the Mercer ranch vanished beneath the storm, leaving the house standing alone against the endless white for most folks. Winter meant loneliness, but for Elias and Lydia, it became a strange kind of sanctuary. The world was shut out, and in its silence, they began to find a rhythm, two souls moving carefully around each other, like travelers who'd stumbled into the same shelter and didn't yet know how to share the fire. Lydia rose before dawn. Lighting the stove and warming the coffee pot, she'd hum softly, a tune Elias didn't recognize but grew to love. He'd come in from feeding the horses, boots heavy with snow, and she'd already have breakfast waiting. "You work too hard," he muttered one morning, brushing frost from his coat. "So do you," she replied with a gentle smile. "At least we're even." He couldn't argue with that as the days stretched thin and pale. They began to talk more, small things at first: weather, chores, the stubborn mule that refused to stay in the barn. But slowly, Lydia's laughter started to fill the space between sentences, and Elias found himself listening for it one evening. She was mending one of his old flannel shirts by the fire. Her fingers moved deftly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Elias watched her from across the room, pretending to read, but his eyes drifted more to her than the page when she pricked her finger. She hissed softly. He set the book aside and crossed the room before he could think twice. "Let me see," he said, taking her hand gently. Her skin was soft, warm from the firelight. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Embarrassed, still," he said, turning her hand over. Examining the tiny bead of blood, he fetched a clean rag, pressing it lightly against her finger. "You should be careful with those needles." She smiled faintly. "You sound like a husband." Elias froze. The rag went still in his hand. Their eyes met, and something changed in the air. Something too fragile to name. After a long moment, Lydia looked away. Flustered. "I only meant you care more than you let on." He cleared his throat. Setting the rag aside, "Ain't much use in letting people freeze or bleed under your roof," he said quietly, but they both knew he was lying, at least. Partly that night, after she'd gone to bed, he sat by the dying fire and found himself staring at her sewing basket. The needle still threaded, the fabric folded neatly on the chair for the first time in years. He felt the ache of wanting something more than survival days turned to weeks. Snow piled higher against the fences. The outside world forgot them, and they, in turn, forgot it. Sometimes she'd read aloud to him from an old Bible or a worn novel she'd brought from back East. His literacy had faded over the years, words turning to blurs on the page. She noticed without mocking him. "Here," she said one afternoon, gently sliding the book toward him, "try this line." He hesitated. The letters swam a little, but she guided his finger, tracing each word. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," he read slowly, his voice deep and unsteady when he finished. She smiled softly. "You did fine." The room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Then he said, almost under his breath, "Ain't sure he's close to me." Lydia's eyes glistened, but her smile didn't falter. "Maybe he sent me to prove otherwise outside." Snow began to fall again, slow, gentle, quiet as forgiveness inside. The distance between them melted a little more, and for the first time since he'd buried his heart, Elias Mercer let himself imagine that maybe, just maybe, spring would come again. By late February, the thaw had begun. The snow retreated from the hills, revealing muddy trails and brittle grass. The air smelled of wet cedar and smoke, the slow promise of spring. Inside the Mercer ranch, the fire burned lower each night. Lydia had begun to hum again as she worked, and Elias caught himself listening from the porch more often than he cared to admit. There was peace now, fragile, precious and unfamiliar, but peace in these parts never lasted long. It was just past noon when Elias saw the dust, a thin line first, too straight to be the wind, too steady to be nothing. He narrowed his eyes, jaw tightening. By the time the riders came into view, two of them, he already knew one of the faces, Charles Hammond. The name alone brought Lydia's laughter to a halt. She looked out the window and went pale. "He's found me." Elias turned from the window, his voice calm but heavy. "Go inside, stay behind the door." "Elias." "Now." The riders slowed as they reached the porch, boots hitting the ground with a crunch of thawed snow. Hammond was a tall man, clean-shaven, with the polished air of someone who'd never missed a meal in his life. His fine wool coat looked wrong against the rough land. Behind him, Sheriff Doyle sat his horse in uneasy silence. Hammond smiled, cold and thin. "Mr. Mercer, I presume?" Elias didn't answer. "I hear you've been keeping company with a woman who isn't yours," Hammond continued, brushing dust from his gloves. "A woman who, I might add, fled from my family's home with property that doesn't belong to her." Lydia stepped out before Elias could stop her, chin high despite the tremor in her hands. "That's a lie." "Charles, you know it?" He turned, his voice smooth as oil. "Do I?" "My brother died expecting to marry you. You left before his body was even cold. I left because you tried to make me your wife instead." She snapped, eyes blazing. You told me Thomas's money would buy my silence. A muscle jumped in Hammond's jaw. Careful. Lydia Elias stepped between them. His voice dropped low, steady. You've said enough. The air thickened. Doyle shifted in his saddle but didn't interfere, the kind of silence that means a man knows something. Ugly's about to happen. Hammond's gaze moved to Elias. I could have you charged with harboring a thief? You think the law cares about your sad little ranch? Elias's fists clenched at his sides. You call her a thief again. And I'll show you what I care about. For a long heartbeat. No one moved. The only sound was the wind creaking through the barn door. Then Hammond stepped closer. Smirking. You'd risk your life for her? Elias met his eyes, voice gravel-soft. I already am. Hammond's smirk faltered. He turned abruptly toward Doyle. You see? A fool in love, he'll hang for this. But Doyle looked away. Tugging at his reins. Don't think the town's got stomach for hanging. A man for kindness. Hammond cursed under his breath. Mounting his horse. This isn't over, he said, glaring down at Lydia. When I come back, I'll have papers that say she's mine. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving silence behind. Lydia trembled. Gripping the porch rail, Elias turned to her. You don't have to be afraid. Her eyes met his. Filled with tears she refused to let fall. He'll ruin you for helping me. Elias shook his head. Can try, but I won't let a man like that decide. What's right under my roof? Lydia's voice broke then. Soft and raw. Why are you doing this for me? He hesitated, then reached out, his rough fingers brushing her cheek. Because I was dead before you knocked on my door, and I'd rather fight and fall than go back to that. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain across the plains, the first of spring, and though danger still loomed, Lydia understood something she hadn't before. Love was never quiet forever. It came like a storm, fierce, sudden, and worth every drop it cost. The rain came that night, heavy, cleansing, endless. It drummed against the roof and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and juniper. Lydia lay awake in the small room at the back of the house. Staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm each drop felt like time itself washing away the fear that had chased her. Halfway across the country, when morning came, the sky was a pale gold, and the land glistened. The world felt new again. Elias was already outside. Mending a section of fence the wind had taken down, his shoulders moved steady beneath his damp shirt. Strong and sure as the land itself, Lydia stepped onto the porch. Wrapping his old wool shawl around her shoulders for a moment, she simply watched him, the way the light caught in his hair, the calm in his movements. This was the man who had once barely spoken to her, the man who'd lived like a ghost among the living. Now he was flesh and warmth and life. He looked up when he sensed her there. You should be inside, he called. Ground still slick. She smiled faintly. You'll fall before I do, he laughed, shaking his head. You might be right. The sound of that laughter, it still startled her. Every time, a sound she never thought this ranch would hold. They spent the morning side by side, fixing fences, feeding horses, talking about everything and nothing. The world beyond their land felt far away. And for the first time, Lydia didn't dread what might come next, but near noon, a shadow appeared on the horizon. One rider. Alone, Lydia stiffened. Elias rested a hand on her shoulder. Wait here. It was Sheriff Doyle. His horse was caked in mud, his face set in a grave expression. Elias met him halfway down the path. You here for Hammond? Doyle nodded. He's gone. Rode out east last night. Seems he ran into trouble with some men he'd cheated. Won't be coming back. Elias said nothing. Doyle looked at Lydia. You're free. Ma'am, no one's looking to claim you now, Lydia exhaled. Trembling. Freedom. It should have felt lighter, but it came heavy, full of all the roads that had led her here. Doyle tipped his hat and rode off without another word. The silence that followed was vast, filled with more than either of them could say. Lydia turned to Elias. It's over. She whispered. He nodded slowly. So it seems, for a moment. She looked past him, toward the open plains, the sun glinting off puddles like mirrors. I suppose I should go, she said softly. You took me in out of kindness. Not promise. Elias's jaw worked. He set his hat aside and took a slow step toward her. You could go, he said. You've every right to. She lifted her gaze to meet his. And if I stayed? He hesitated only a heartbeat. Then the door stays open. The words hung between them, simple. Unpolished, real. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them. You really don't say much, do you? He shook his head, stepping closer still. Only what matters. The wind moved across the grass, carrying the scent of spring, wildflowers, and wet dust. The perfume of renewal. Elias reached out, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away this time. Inside the house, the fire still burned, not bright, but steady, the kind that lasts later that evening. As the sun dipped low and the horizon caught fire, Lydia stood by the doorway, watching the last of the rain fade from the clouds. Elias joined her quietly, his presence solid beside her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for once, he didn't tense or pull away. No vows, no papers, no grand declarations, just two souls who had finally found a place to rest, not out of charity, but out of choice. And as the light faded over the wide, forgiving land, the lonely rancher's house no longer felt empty. It felt like home.